Hey, here's a super quick message before the show begins. You can get 6 issues for £1 and a free Moleskine notebook branded with The Week by going to theweek.co.uk/offer and entering the promo code podcast. See, that was so quick that if you skipped it, you missed the start of the show. Have you now skipped back too far and heard this message again? Don't worry, I'll recap. Get 6 issues for £1 and a free Moleskine notebook branded with The Week. Just go to theweek.co.uk/offer and enter the promo code podcast. Now on with the show. It's the week ending Saturday, the 20th of April, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen firefighters at Notre Dame saving most of the iconic cathedral, the Mueller report quietly released over Easter weekend, and Nigel Farage's new Brexit party leading a poll in the European elections. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the Week's digital team are Rebecca Gillie and Arion McNicoll, and from the Week Junior, it is editor and human being Felicity Capon. And starting the show this week is Rebecca. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Is global jihad the next tech disruptor?
A combination of regulatory and technological progress is needed for the likes of Bitcoin, Ethereum and Litecoin to ever be practical for everyday use. The underlying blockchain technology is already being adopted by more than 75 of the world's biggest banks, meaning the similarities between the two may even stretch to the fact that it could be on the verge of mass adoption. All it might take is for one of the tech giants like Apple, Amazon or Google to integrate them into one of their platforms for their popularity to explode.
That was an explainer video for The Independent, all about cryptocurrency. Rebecca, this again, Bitcoin? Well, as the video predicted, a major organisation has now incorporated Bitcoin into its structure. The surprise is exactly which organisation it is.
So this week there was a story reported in The Independent that Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is the largest jihadi group active in Syria, they control most of Idlib province, the only province that hasn't been reconquered by the government, have been advertising in their weekly magazine. It's nice to see how the...
Are you a subscriber at The Week?
I think it might be against the law to be, so I think we'll stick with no, we are not subscribers. They have been advertising for their sympathisers to send them donations via cryptocurrency. Okay.
And that's a surprise. Why? I mean, we know that lots of nefarious characters use Bitcoin, as well as a growing number of people involved in more... I was going to say kosher pursuits then, but in this context that feels wrong. More halal pursuits. So in the case of, terrorist organisations wanting to use Bitcoin, is that a surprise?
No, it's not a surprise really in some respects because there are obvious advantages to using cryptocurrency. Obviously, it's a lot more secure and anonymous than actual cash donations. It's harder, but not impossible for authorities to trace. But what has hampered this from really taking off before is that it's obviously quite difficult to spend Bitcoin or Ethereum or whatever cryptocurrency, especially if you're on the front lines of a war in a failed state. Quite difficult to work out how to cash that money in. But what we've seen now is this is a major jihadi organisation who obviously now feel secure enough that this is the future for them, that they can transform those donations into cash money and use it to fund their pursuits.
Except I wonder, Felicity, whether this is about actually funding, guns and soldiers in northern Syria, or whether this is actually about propaganda of the kind that this newsletter itself is. I mean, you can use Bitcoin in the United States, can't you? You can use Bitcoin in Europe. And is this actually really about spending money to propagate their message on the internet?
Do you mean it's the idea that they're sort of showing off that they know about these technological capabilities and therefore they're a force to be reckoned with just because they sort of have an understanding of cryptocurrency? It's similar... Partly
that, but also they might literally use the funds for propaganda rather than actually frontline warfare.
Yeah, I don't see why not. But it's similar to that story we had... a few months back now about Al-Shabaab, who suddenly decided that single-use plastics was really bad for the environment, and it's this sort of weird human face of terrorist groups when they're sort of taking part in activities and in understandings that we all are. They're not so far removed from us as perhaps we like to think. But I am slightly sceptical about how dependent these groups are on cryptocurrency, because I would have thought, I'm not an expert on this at all, you will not be shocked to hear, but I would have thought it's just too volatile to really be, for terrorist groups to really depend on it. I mean, you saw in 2017 multiple cryptocurrency crowdfunding campaigns by jihadist groups because there was that huge Bitcoin price spike. But since then, it's been all over the place, and I wouldn't have thought they can really rely on that. And if you look at Islamic State, I've read so many articles where cryptocurrency wasn't mentioned at all. I think it's still cash, which is, for the reasons that Rebecca was saying, it's extremely hard to sort of wire Bitcoin around the world. Even if you can convert cash into Bitcoin, it's very hard to then move it around.
And also, for people who are behind the Bitcoin movement, Arion, and who want this to go mainstream, this is not the best association to be published about, is it?
Definitely not, and it's fascinating the minute you start digging into this story as an example of sort of stories of negativity around cryptocurrency generally. But the first results you'll encounter the minute you type in terrorism funded by cryptocurrency, reports from Bitcoin and other crypto-friendly organizations saying actually it's much more secure than you might think, and actually terrorists and criminals are moving away from using cryptocurrencies in general because, in fact, all the latest evidence is that, in fact, it's much more traceable than people might like to think it is. Of course, the libertarians amongst the virtual currency sort of advocates say this is one of its strengths and it remains an untraceable or less traceable currency than some other currencies, but it is more traceable than terrorists might initially think on the surface of it, as evidenced by the fact that Ross Ulbricht, for example, the 31-year-old American who created Silk Road, was arrested. You know, this is a traceable currency, so it's surprising in a way that terrorists are still choosing to use it.
And several people have been arrested and convicted of trying to fund jihadi groups through cryptocurrency, so it can be traced. But as you were just talking about Silk Road then, Arion, which reminded me that there's an even weirder aspect of this, where last year Benjamin Crick, writing for Medium, did a report on a platform called Sadaka Coin, which is a terrorist crowdfunding group. You can only access it on the dark web without going into all the dark web, but it can't be accessed on a regular browser. But it basically is crowdfunding for terrorism. If you're a terrorist with a project, you can apply to list it on there, and if people like the idea, then they can donate cryptocurrency to you. Supposedly you can donate cryptocurrency to help them carry out those plans.
But again, you're saying this with a kind of quizzical smile. It isn't a surprise to me. This is exactly what you'd expect Bitcoin and other deep web operations to be utilised.
You say that, but one of the main characteristics of Al-Qaeda, which now seems a long time ago, the heyday of Al-Qaeda, but they never used mobile phones. They never used computers that had internet connectivity.
You sound like one of those people talking about the IRA, when they're like, well, the thing about them is they always called and told you when they were about to bomb. Al-Qaeda didn't use any of this stuff. They did it properly.
I'm not advertising this as a virtue of Al-Qaeda. But Osama bin Laden didn't use a computer that connected to the internet. He would film all of his propaganda onto tapes, and then he would have a human messenger carry the tapes away. It's a massive change from, in really a relatively short period of time, it's a massive change to the way that terrorism is funded, and as we touched on earlier, the way it's advertised as well.
Even without these associations of terrorism, though, Felicity, is this kind of libertarian internet ideal as fashionable as it used to be? The idea of an unregulated internet used to be quite trendy amongst people, regardless of their sort of political beliefs or where they were in the world. And it seems to me now, if you look at the reaction against Julian Assange, for example, last week, if you look at the support there is in this country for this new law coming in where pornography websites will have to verify age, it seems like people want more regulation of the internet in the developed world, at least, not less.
I think so. I think the trend is definitely moving. It feels like it's moving more to regulation and privacy, and the kind of horrors of what's online is too scary. And I think it's swinging back the other way, that, like you say, that people want to see more of that. I think Assange is a tricky one because I think people have such a problem with him that they can't get to kind of WikiLeaks and what it's done and the good it's done and that sort of thing. So I think Assange has really kind of muddied the waters of how people feel about things like WikiLeaks.
Do we see more regulation coming down the pipe for cryptocurrency, though? If it's clearly associated with these kinds of groups and it fluctuates wildly and a big mainstream tech giant has yet to get behind it and say, right, pay with PayPal using cryptocurrency, is it ever going to really take?
I'm not sure about regulation necessarily, but I think that we are increasingly seeing the same academics and researchers whose work contributed to the establishing of virtual currencies, now moving into the sort of software security side of it. And there's reasons why that's advantageous, particularly to law enforcement. But I think that regulation itself is more complicated because of the impetus that gave birth to these currencies in the first place.
And one thing I will thank you for, Rebecca, in this story and your selection of it is that Internet Explainer video on the Independent's website, because it had something in it which I'd never seen before, which was the sense of these huge farms that are now mining cryptocurrency. And again, let's not get into the detail because it is so mind-blowingly complicated, but there appears to be a bit of a rebellion against that as well. It's no longer a case of just mining currency using your computer. You are creating an environmental cost by doing so.
Yeah, that's right. And actually, it's funny because when I was talking earlier about this Sadaka Coin website, one of the things that they advertised to visitors was, if you have a powerful computer, would you like to join in the jihadi struggle by using your computer to mine cryptocurrency? And, illustrated with quotes from the Quran, it just creates this really bizarre juxtaposition of quotes from ancient religious texts alongside, well, if you can't carry out jihad exactly as it's written in the Quran, like maybe you could help by mining cryptocurrency. It's just one of the things I find really fascinating of how 21st century technology is being used by groups who want to impose kind of medieval style law.
I mean, I think it was mind-blowing and complicated. I'm not sure I fully understood it, but I hadn't realised there were these massive farms. And also the idea that they take up so much space, and that they were using, there was the one in Norway, they were using sort of green technologies to, which was just bizarre because it takes up, this huge caves filled with these computers. And it's just interesting that I always think technology is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And actually the most powerful computers have to be huge and take up all this space. It's just bizarre.
Okay, Felicity, you're up next after this. Okay, Felicity, what do you think this week will be remembered for?
The macro-micro problem that's not so out of sight, out of mind.
8 million metric tons of plastic trash enters the sea from land every year. The equivalent of 5 plastic bags filled with trash for every foot of coastline in the world. Across our ocean, plastic trash flows into circulation, dispersed almost everywhere, but concentrating in huge swaths in the midst of global currents, breaking down into smaller and smaller pieces, ingested by species across the marine world, and sinking to the bottom of the sea.
That was a documentary for National Geographic about microplastics. Felicity, what's the story you want to focus on today?
It's a really positive, feel-good environmental story for you, Ollie. Mm-hmm. So this is a story that researchers are now finding microplastics everywhere they look, in rivers, the deepest oceans, and soils around the world.
But it really is everywhere.
It really is everywhere.
We knew rivers and soils.
We knew...
The new thing is mountains.
Yeah, so the point of this new study, which was published in Nature Communications, is that it was the first to show microplastic is raining down just as much in remote environments as in cities or places that you might expect to see more of it. And it's kind of revealed that microplastics can travel significant distances through the wind. So the team they were collecting samples from high altitudes in the Pyrenees that were far from sources of plastic waste. So the nearest village was 6 kilometres away, the nearest city was 120 kilometres away. And they found on average 365 plastic particles, fibres and films were deposited per square metre every single day.
And
so you can't escape it.
And when we're talking about microplastics here, we're not just talking about microbeads. We're not just talking about little things that are in lotions and creams. We're talking about plastics that degrade down to a tiny, unobservable size.
Yeah, so the idea is that roughly 335 metric tons of plastic is produced every year. And it does degrade, but extremely slowly over centuries, and it's just slowly broken down into smaller and smaller pieces. And the most common microplastics that were found in this survey were polystyrene and polyethylene, which are both widely used in single-use packaging, such as plastic bags and plastic bottles. So it's that type of plastic.
However horrifying it is, though, Arion, that I think part of this study as well, or related studies, shows that literally every mammal they've looked at has got microplastics in it. You could at least say, well, it's in us anyway, and what are the health effects? We don't know. It could be nothing.
That's true, and I think that this discovery warrants further investigation of the effects on human health, not just humans, but all biological creatures, which, we are attentive to. But, it was only as recently as last year that microplastics were first found in human stools. So it's very recent it's very recently that we've started undertaking proper scientific inquiry to find out what the effects are on human bodies. But we do know, for example, that microplastics found in birds have been found to change the shape of their intestines. So it could be nothing, but it could be really terrible.
But also the idea that the effects of microplastics in the human body could be okay. When you think about how plastic is made, it comes from crude oil and gas, and I can't see how on earth that could possibly be good for you. I mean,
for example, we know that most people breathing in petrol fumes aren't going to have a related cancer from that, but some people will. I'm just saying, the scale of it might sound horrible, but actually it might not actually cause a life-ending condition for anybody.
Yeah, well, the issue is that we don't know, and there's nothing we can really do about it because, as Felicity was saying, it takes hundreds of years for plastic to degrade. So even if we took immediate action, even if we were to say, take a really extreme stance and ban all single-use plastic bags or plastic packaging, we'd still have hundreds of years to go, not being able to prevent the spread of microplastics. So either way, we're going to find out whether they're harmful or not over the next few centuries.
Which is true, but I'm not sure it's as doom and gloom as that. And I also wonder how helpful it is to take this very kind of, there's nothing that can be done, we just have to live with it. I mean, I think there are brilliant people and brilliant companies who are working to find uses for microplastics and to kind of turn the tide on this. And I was really interested to learn that.
But not the microplastics you can find in the air.
Not in the air. True.
That's the stuff we're talking about, the stuff you can breathe in.
True.
You can't reuse that, can you?
Not necessarily, but I think there are breakthroughs being made all the time into how, for example, Ellen MacArthur is really good on this, and it's all about sort of changing.
The yachtswoman.
Yeah, the yachtswoman, and I think that's part of it because she spent so much of her career sailing around the world that she can see for herself the dangers. And I think that's part of it. I think living in cities is that we're not always aware of the damage that's being done. I think it's people on the front line, like Ellen MacArthur, or for example, like Anglesey, I think was just named the first plastic-free place in the UK because obviously they're on an island, so they can see the damage being done.
What's Ellen MacArthur doing?
Well, she's involved in all sorts of initiatives, but her main theory on this is that she wants to kind of rethink the entire system and that plastic, we need to move it from being a linear production process where it always ends up as waste into one that can be fed back into the economy so that it never becomes waste. And there are initiatives, there are people who are doing that, so using microplastics to create, because the fact that it takes so long to break down could be a benefit for some people, so you could create roads, and there are startup companies that are now putting microplastics into concrete to create roads. And there's other amazing things, like they've just worked out that there are actually some organisms that can break down plastic. So mealworms, waxworms can break down some kinds of plastic in a matter of days. Some microbes can as well. And you're also seeing more biodegradable bioplastics. So companies returning to plants and going back to plants like the rubber tree to start making plastics.
I mean, there is something as well that we as consumers can do, isn't there, Rebecca, which is just, I suppose, be more responsible about the plastics that we do use. It's probably unachievable almost to live plastic free, but to say, and for example, I think as a parent, you look at a Lego brick, that's made of plastic, but it will probably last 50 years and get played with by 10 other children after my kids finish with it, whereas a piece of crap cover-mounted Peppa Pig lollipop holder is going straight in the bin after 10 minutes, and it's thinking, do I need that bit of plastic in my life?
I mean, as a non-parent, some of that was impenetrable to me, but from what I think you're saying, I think in a way almost that discussing whether or not microplastics are harmful is almost in a way kind of a red herring, because I don't think we need any more evidence that the amount of plastic that we are producing and disposing of irresponsibly is incredibly, dangerous and damaging to the planet. And I think it would be disingenuous to get bogged down in, working out exactly how harmful microplastics are and letting that be a main subject of debate when we already have ample evidence that the amount of plastic we're producing is very dangerous.
But to your point, Olly, I think this is genuinely one of those cases where individuals can make a difference by the choices that they make, and they can choose to get fewer Peppa Pig lollipop holders.
I made that up, by the way, if Pepper's lawyers are listening.
Listening to you religiously, like, yes, that must be a thing.
But also, fewer plastic bottles as well. Like the amount of plastic bottles that we still consume around the world is staggering.
Yeah, well, hold on. Which of us in this room gets our milk in glass bottles? There you go. None of us, thank you. So we're all getting plastic bottles from the supermarket. So none of us are making that choice. That's an easy choice you can make. Literally none of us, for convenience, are doing that.
I don't drink
You've
milk.
shamed us all, Olly.
You don't drink milk. Do you drink like oat milk or something, or soya milk?
But this is what's so frustrating.
Yes or no? Do you drink oat milk or soy milk?
I refuse to answer this question because this is like all the trolls and the...
I'm not being a troll. I'm saying that is a small thing we can all do that none of us have bothered to do.
But I think it's incredibly, I don't know, I just think sort of that phrase, making perfect the opposite of good or whatever, it's just so unhelpful.
I'm not Michael Gove in this scenario, that is unfair.
And you're seeing it with the people on Twitter about the Extinction Rebellion protests in London who would like point out in every single picture of the protesters like, oh, there's a plastic bottle, there's a coffee cup, and this is really like mean-spirited, nasty kind of attacking each other, and I just don't think that's going to be helpful. I think there has to be a kind of also a mentality shift in how we talk about this.
Okay, I think she drinks soya milk in plasticated cartons. We'll have one last story to come after this. And so finally this week, it is Arion. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
This week we learned that working 9 to 5 is no way to make a living.
Whatever you want to be a great people, a great company, you have to work very hard. You have to suffer a lot of, terrible things, wrongs and terrible things, before you be a hero. It is spiritual. And think out of the box. You have to think out of the box to win.
That was Jack Ma, the founder of Alibaba, speaking to CNN Business on Tuesday. Arion, just quick revision on what Alibaba is for those of us not familiar with the Chinese internet.
It's pretty much China's answer to Amazon.
And he, therefore, is China's answer to Jeff Bezos?
Yes, he is personally very wealthy and the company is enormously profitable. So he's a big deal in Chinese business. And this week he came out arguing, not just once, but multiple times, because reporters kept coming back to him, in favor of this system called the 996 system, which advocates working for 12 hours every day from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week.
And the reaction online, unusually for China, was, that's no way to live.
Yes, actually. And a combination of people who are in favour of it. There's a whole lot of acolytes of Ma, the way there are of Bezos, but
if most people were in favour of it, it wouldn't have made the news at all, right?
Plenty of people who were against it.
Was Chinese people who are really into productivity
still
actually said
this is actually too much.
You're actually mad.
Absolutely right. And what he was saying was that because China's economy has slowed in terms of growth over the past decade or so, that it really is a matter of doubling down on working and working hard in every person that's required to lift China's economy back out of the rut that it's sort of got into.
Rebecca, do you think this is more a Chinese thing? You know, the fact that as a nation, as I say, they are very focused on growing and putting effort into work. Or is it a tech startup thing? Because Ma does come from that kind of Silicon Valley mindset, even though he's in China. Yeah,
I mean, it's a delightful combination of both of those things, I think. I think that certainly there's, in more communal cultures, I think it is more common to see this idea that you've got to be extremely loyal to your workplace. I mean, you see the same thing in Japan, where they actually have a word, karoshi, for working yourself to death. But I do think there's certainly you see it in Silicon Valley as well. When my personal favourite game of all time, Red Dead Redemption 2, came out last year, there were reports that employees at Rockstar who made the game were working 100-hour weeks in the run-up to the game's release to get it all done on time. And that's, that made a splash because it was such an anticipated game and people were interested. But it's not by any means uncommon in Silicon Valley for people to work those kinds of hours.
I mean, the problem is for the product, whether it's Red Dead Redemption 2 or whether it's a massive online store, it does work, doesn't it? If more people work longer hours, then you are more productive as a business.
No, I don't think so. And I think you're seeing a backlash against it, actually, Because, I just feel so many workplaces are actually seeing that you can be more productive in a shorter space of time. And there have been studies. There was a New Zealand one where a company was carrying out a 4-day week, and there was lower stress and increased productivity. And I'm sure there's something in that. I think the idea of just squeezing out more and more from workers until they eventually fall over is just ridiculous. And I think you're seeing, there was a really interesting piece in the Financial Times a couple of months ago about the revival of the work and thinking of John Ruskin, who was very against, he was very worried about industrialization and workers just being worked and what this was doing for them. And he wrote in 1851, 3 things are needed. Workers must be fit to do the work, they must not do too much of it, and they must have a sense of success in it. And this FT piece was making the point that you're seeing more and more companies kind of adopt this mentality. The MIT Sloan School of Management has set up the Good Jobs Institute, which is aimed at service workers. And the principle behind it is scheduling slack into the system so that staff can come up with new ideas and innovation. So it's this idea of like getting a sense of fulfillment, getting more from your workers. And that is not working them so hard that you're squeezing the life force out of them.
But the Victorian industrialists were dealing with factories and factory conditions and, children dying all about and all the rest of it. I mean, we're not talking about that here generally. I know obviously there are people working in manual jobs, but, if you're talking about people working at a computer all day, it is just in the nature of constant 24/7 communication that they will continue getting emails and prods and social media messages right the way through the night.
That's right, but I think that that's part of the problem as well, if you see it as a problem. The reality is that reduction in time spent working during any given week since the Industrial Revolution has reverted, and we now find ourselves, particularly in the developed world, working harder than we have for a long time. And it is led by companies like Alibaba and Amazon and the sort of the tech industry, but work in general is going up. And in fact, even though manual labor takes a very obvious and literal and physical toll on the body, the kinds of costs associated with sitting at your desk all day can actually be physical. It's found that cardiovascular disease is much increased in people who spend a long time sitting, but it's also it takes a big mental toll, and I think that's another great problem.
But from that point of view then, if Felicity and Arion are both right, Rebecca, then it's good, isn't it, that this is being discussed in China, of all places, that there is a rebellion against this way of thinking.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, it's not just a matter of do you agree or do you disagree. Study after study has shown that productivity does not continue to increase infinitely with effort. I think most studies come in at about 50 hours a week is the point where if you start working longer than that, your productivity actually goes down. So from the point of view because one of the reactions to Jack Ma's comment was from the Chinese official state newspapers. So obviously everything that appears in there is kind of surreptitiously government approved. They came down against it too, and it makes perfect sense because it's not just they're not just speaking from a welfare perspective. They're also speaking from a productivity perspective. Especially in what I find really interesting is that we're having a conversation about automation at the same time, and how there aren't going to be jobs for everyone, and everything's going to be automated. But in these cutting edge tech industry is where we are seeing people working these incredibly long hours.
But can't you just use your own intelligence to say whether you want to kind of work to live or live to work? But if someone like Jack Ma, one of the world's richest people, says, this is how I did it, I'm an entrepreneur, I did 996, there is an audience out there that are hungry to learn how to do that so that they can do that too. And that's their choice if they want to be an entrepreneur, isn't it? It's different to being forced into working hours working for someone else.
I think that's so true. And I think that it's incredibly easy for someone who is passionate about their job and is already a billionaire to argue for never switching off. The idea that he would get up every day and that the thing he wanted to do was the work that had brought him great riches is unsurprising. But a lot of people work in jobs that aren't necessarily stimulating and aren't necessarily the thing that they want to do with their every waking hour. So sure, for anyone who's on a path to be a self-made multi-billionaire aided by the Chinese state, then maybe it's useful to know how one person did it, but it's not going to account for every single person.
But some people will find it inspiring. They'll think, actually, I could do this too if I just put the work in. That's kind of the message, isn't it?
Well, and to some extent, his comments were misinterpreted because if you read the longer quote, he is talking specifically about if you want to become as successful as I am, and he even said, we don't have any shortage of employees who are happy to work 9 to 5. So he wasn't saying that everyone should do that, but I do think that there is a culture of companies expecting their everyday bottom rung workers to have the same sense of loyalty and devotion as the CEO of the company has, which is just completely unrealistic and not feasible.
But it's also a very self-absorbed point of view about me. If I work this hard, I will become like Jack Ma, which might be true to some extent. But what about the responsibilities that you might have to elderly members of your family or the community, or carving out space in the week where it's not just me, how do I become a millionaire? Oh, okay, I find work really, really hard. It's about how do we make time for the other people who might need us?
What is the longest shift that you've all pulled, Arion?
When I worked on my student newspaper at university, we often wouldn't do
it's very
anything.
Revealing that's the most work you've done, despite now working for a professional publisher.
But we often wouldn't do anything towards the edition that was coming up, and a deadline was around the corner, and then we'd just work for 2 or 3 days straight without sleeping.
Mm-hmm. Rebecca?
This seems a bit lame now. Probably maybe 12 hours.
Yeah. Do you remember the context?
Yeah, it was here.
Deadline coming up, or busy political series, or what?
No, I was just bookend activities, morning and evening newsletters we have. But normally we would have a break in between, but I was also covering for somebody else at the same time.
Okay. Felicity?
Yeah, I think the same, sort of doing the morning shift to get in to do the morning news, and then this is in a previous job, and then sort of staying late. Or if there was a general election, you'd stay up to do. But I mean, I quite enjoyed that. So.
Yeah, that's the thing. I think mine would be election coverage as well. I'm pretty sure I did a 28-hour stint, but I mean that's kind of fun, isn't it? It's
and I think
different
the US elections with Trump, I think I pretty much pulled an all-nighter, but out of choice. I don't think anyone was telling me I had to.
You'd be up all night watching it anyway. It's a bit different, isn't it? That is it from this edition of The Week Unwrapped. My thanks to Rebecca Gillie, Felicity Capon and Arion McNicoll. And over this bank holiday weekend, why don't you pull a long shift and consume our entire back catalogue in 6 12-hour runs. Discover it when you subscribe to The Week Unwrapped on your podcast app of choice. And don't forget, you can receive 6 issues of The Week magazine for £1 and a free moleskin notebook branded with The Week. Just go to theweek.co.uk/offer and remember to enter the promo code podcast. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. Until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.